an entire console's game library in the palm of your hand. There's few ideas in the world of vintage gaming that are as intoxicating as that. Whether it comes down to simply wanting to save on space, sample from a nearly limitless stream of ROM hacks, or prevent wear and tear on aging hardware, it's easy to understand the popularity of flash cards among gaming enthusiasts today. From Retro USB's Power Pack for the NES, to Terra Onion's Mega SD for the Sega Genesis, today, the most well-known and widely used flash cards remain the EverDrive, from Ukraine-based developer Krikzz. In past episodes, we've taken a look at just about all the different EverDrive offerings from the NES, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, and beyond. Since then, a number of EverDrives have seen robust firmware updates, as well as new hardware revisions to allow for additional features, and more. So let's take a look at where these updates stand in 2020, and if they can justify trading up to a new version now, or anytime soon. Over the course of the past decade, the surge in popularity of vintage video games has driven the prices of original consoles and cartridges to insane heights. If you're just getting into, or simply just returning to the hobby after many years, the sticker shock might just cause you to throw up your hands and say forget it. While mini consoles have been a good outlet for those looking to indulge in a quick hit of nostalgia, the Mr. FPGA continues to assert itself as the ultimate all-in-one solution for the more hands-on aficionado. But for those looking to play on original hardware, it makes sense that flash carts, devices created to allow for the loading of game ROMs, hacks, and more on a variety of consoles, have become somewhat of an essential device in one's gaming repertoire. If you've done any research at all on the subject, you're undoubtedly familiar with the name EverDrive. Designed on a per-console basis, an EverDrive can load game ROMs from an SD card so that the original system sees the game as if it was a real thing. EverDrives and other flash carts are insanely useful to not only people looking to just play some games, but also homebrew developers, ROM hackers, content creators, and more. As the lineup of EverDrives have expanded and matured, Krikzz has adopted a standardized naming scheme to define the power levels of the multitude of revisions. The X3 is the ultra-budget-friendly option, while the X5 presents the most even-keeled balance between functionality and price. The X7 has some super cool and useful features like in-game menus and save states, at the cost of a premium price tag. So what necessitates a new version of an EverDrive? Many times it comes down to outside circumstances. Most common among these factors are various components reaching end of life, or in other words, they're just not being manufactured any longer, and it becomes more cost-effective to just produce something with newer components. So if you're being forced to redesign an entire device to use newer FPGAs and other parts, you may as well take advantage of the increase in power that comes along with those newer components, right? This has led to top-of-the-line X7 versions of many EverDrives that predate the naming scheme altogether, such as the EverDrive64, Master EverDrive, and Game Gear EverDrive. In 2019, we were introduced to the Pro series, which usually include interesting abilities that might lie outside the original scope of functionality, beyond even the X7's strengths. These enhancements obviously require beefier hardware and generally aren't intended to be replacements for the older versions, but are more for those looking to play as wide of a variety of games as possible. An additional side effect to all these redesigns come down to cartridge voltage. Several years back, Renee from DB Electronics noted that a handful of EverDrives had mismatched voltages to what the system required. This caused additional heat dissipation, and as a result, extra wear and tear on the hardware. The devices that were most guilty of this have now received updates to make them more friendly towards the original innards of our favorite systems. That said, it's important to remember that even though support might wane over time, the existence of the new models do not negate the older ones. If you have an older version, it's still totally functional. So it really only comes down to whether or not the new features are meaningful enough for you to want to upgrade. Several of the EverDrives covered in this episode were sent to us by both Stone Age Gamer and Krikzz so that we could look at these new versions and see what they offer over the older ones to help you decide whether or not it makes sense to upgrade. Among the EverDrives covered in previous videos, there were two in particular that were in pretty dire need of an update: the Master System EverDrive and the Game Gear EverDrive. Sure, some would say that these are probably among the least essential of Sega's consoles, but chances are they probably didn't spend a portion of their formative years with them, like some of us. Still, my love for these consoles does nothing to alter the idea that these were likely among the least sought-after EverDrives available. As such, it makes sense that it took so long for them to receive a thorough overhaul. It's not that the original versions weren't functional, but the ultra-slow game loading was likely the biggest turnoff for potential buyers. Well, that, and that Master System games are backwards compatible on the 16-bit Genesis hardware, which likely makes it completely redundant, unless you were dead set on using the original Master System console. Regardless, the arrival of the Master EverDrive X7 in early 2018 was welcome for the small fanbase who were interested in a lavish flash cart for their favorite 8-bit system. The Game Gear EverDrive X7 came 2 years later, in early 2020, and was undoubtedly of more interest to that system's fans because the games weren't as easily playable on other systems. But also, a flash cart for a handheld system is pretty appealing, especially on one that's as unwieldy as the Game Gear might be. There were no X3 or X5 models of either in tow because the time to develop them would likely take more effort than it was realistically worth. By making the X7 versions available as a wholesale replacement for the original with no other option is akin to gently being told to get it over with and buy the best flash carts these systems will likely ever see. Both of these sell for around $130 US, which is a bit of a markup from the previous versions, but you can expect a good bang for your buck here. The original Master EverDrive used standard-size SD cards, but like most devices these days, the X7 has moved on to the more conventional, but easier to lose micro SD. On the other hand, the original Game Gear EverDrive always used a micro SD, but you needed to completely unscrew and open up the shell to access the slot. The Game Gear X7 has an opening for easy access to the card. Now, because the Game Gear and Master System are so fundamentally similar to each other, it's unsurprisingly that so is the functionality of each of these EverDrives. In fact, both even use the exact same OS. Utilizing the same no-frills text-based menu system that is typical of pretty much every EverDrive ever, navigation is quick and breezy as you scroll through a list of files using the D-pad, and in and out of folders using the 1 and 2 buttons. And what is perhaps the most obvious improvement over the old iterations, booting up games is now nearly instantaneous across the board with everything that I tested, taking no more than a second or two. While this is good and all, it's most likely the other major update that will be the key factor in convincing people that it's worth upgrading to this newer version. An in-game menu that allows for save states. The in-game menu is tied to a 3-input hotkey combination that can be set within the option menu. The default sequence is set to simultaneously pressing the D-pad up plus button 1 and 2, which offers the option to save your state, load that save state, and return to the menu. Through no fault of Krikzz, the Master System's lack of buttons quickly reveals an unavoidable reality. Certain games will be nearly unplayable with the in-game menu activated, since there's just loads of games out there where you'll be constantly pressing any combination you could possibly choose. The fact is, you'll likely have to rebind the button combination or simply turn it off altogether in certain situations. Aleste, aka Power Strike, is a good example of just how completely unplayable a game can become. I was disappointed that the Game Gear X7 didn't throw the start button into the mix for setting the hotkey, which would have completely remedied this issue by allowing for such combinations like down plus start. Unless there's some specific hardware reason for not allowing this, hopefully that can be incorporated into future OS updates. There's one extremely important asterisk when it comes to the Master EverDrive and its use of an in-game menu. The trick it uses to access it can only be done on original Master System hardware. If you try to use it on a Genesis through a power-based converter, it seems to break compatibility, period. Needless to say, unless you're planning on using the Master EverDrive on an actual Master System, this is probably not the right choice for you. Thankfully, there is another option I'll be talking about later on in the episode. Overall game compatibility was excellent on the older versions, with both being able to boot and play their specific ROMs regardless of region. That standard remains true here. But let's not forget that the Game Gear is fully backwards compatible with Master System and Mark III games, which opens that library to the portable. Of course, the Master EverDrive cannot play Game Gear titles, although there has been a number of conversions to Game Gear ROMs to make them work on the SMS. On the older Master EverDrive, the chances of whether or not these would work was pretty spotty, but I feel that the compatibility is much better with the more powerful hardware. Most of the heavy hitters work fine, such as Gunstar Heroes and Magical Puzzle Popples. Even some fan translations, like the one for Phantasy Star Adventure, have received this treatment. Still, you might run into some graphical weirdness, which is usually related to opening up the viewing area of the oftentimes cramped Game Gear resolution. On the topic of Gunstar Heroes, while it might not look it by today's standards, porting the run-and-gun classic to the Game Gear was an incredible feat for the time. If there was one game that people should check out using the GG EverDrive, this was it. Except, it was one of the few incompatible games on the original. Clearly, this was a priority for Krikzz, and the game runs on the GG EverDrive X7 exceedingly well. A number of other small incompatibilities have also been ironed out. Finally, Sega SG-1000 games are once again supported with a slightly altered color palette. Compatibility could be spotty before, and based on a little testing, it seems to be quite a bit better now. I expected equal performance between both EverDrives, but that wasn't quite the case. Congo Bongo works flawlessly on the Game Gear, while it's completely broken on the Master System. Thankfully, Dragon Wang runs without issue on both platforms. Like their original versions, one's interest in either of these particular updates come down to how passionate you are about the console. For me, the save states in the Master EverDrive X7 were a pretty big deal for SMS games because they're extremely useful for gathering footage for our videos. The GG EverDrive X7 has a strong appeal because it puts such a large amount of games on a single, and more importantly, portable cartridge. Now, as I did in the previous EverDrive focused episodes, let's take a look at some various things I think you should check out if you end up with one of these carts. Nintendo 64 fans are some of the most passionate out there. It's really impressive. While I don't quite fit in among their ranks, maybe I just never found the right game to really rope me in. That's why the EverDrive 64 was one of the most interesting to me, the sheer number of games on the system that I never had a chance to play. Early on, there were a number of updates, or point versions that incorporated additional features, with the biggest jump being from version 2.5 to 3.0. We checked out the latest and greatest in the first console EverDrive episode. But in September 2019, Krikzz released the EverDrive64 X7 for around $180, making it one of the pricier options in the lineup. The X7 represents a nice jump for owners of earlier EverDrive 64 versions, but if you jumped on this train with 3.0, is there really any reason to upgrade? Well, the short and sweet answer, no. I'm sorry to be the bearer of disappointment, but outside of a few hardware tweaks, the X7 is more of a rebranding of version 3.0 than anything else. Even if you're looking for any reason at all to upgrade from a 3.0, said hardware tweaks will do virtually nothing to make the prospect any more enticing. First, the full-sized SD card slot has been moved to the side and replaced with a micro SD slot. And secondly, an Ultra CIC 3 chip allows for auto-detection of hardware regions, where on previous versions you had to flip a physical switch on top of the PCB between NTSC and PAL. The EverDrive 64 version 3 had pretty thorough compatibility, working with just about the entire library. Certain games still need to be patched specifically to work with an EverDrive, such as the Banjo games, but it's safe to say that there's going to be no real disappointments to be had with the X7 in this department. Playing 64DD conversions is still pretty novel, especially as the price of real DD drives has begun to really skyrocket in recent years. The NES emulator is a cool bonus, but it's not exactly a feature that you're buying this thing for. It should be noted that additional features could be on the way to further bolster its appeal to those looking to upgrade. But in general, the same features I talked about in the previous video apply to the new version, like NES emulation. But there have been other OS updates that I neglected to talk about back then that might be relevant to your interests nowadays. Chief among these is auto patching, which can apply a temporary .ips or .aps patch to a game. This is great news for anyone who wants to dabble around with the anti-aliasing hacks that can be achieved using a Game Shark, and don't want to go through the hassle of inputting the cheat code on your own. Owners of the Ultra HDMI mod might not be super interested, but this is a great alternative for those without, or anyone looking to double dose on anti-aliasing removal. But how effective it is really depends on the game. This used to be done by placing a patch file in the auto folder, but as of firmware 3.04, things have changed a little bit. The patch must now be placed within the same folder as the ROM file, or in the patcher folder. If you choose this method, the patch must be renamed to match the ROM it'll be applied to's 8 alphanumeric character CRC high number. You can get this by looking at the ROM info in the main menu. I have to say that this feels a bit more obtuse than the older method, and can result in a bit of an organizational nightmare. Either your ROM folder is more cluttered than it needs to be, or you have a bunch of patches where you have no idea what game it's associated with. The CPak manager allows you to back up the data on the memory pack that's inserted into your controller. Even though it's mostly third-party games that use this medium for its save files, I'm often surprised just how quickly these things can fill up. Choosing to save the CPak file as controller number or the last game you played becomes important when deciding if you want to organize your saves just a bit more. If you choose the latter, then keep in mind you'll need to dump the memory pack data before loading something else, lest you want to lose track of what's what. I personally wish this option could be tweaked so that you could automatically dump or load the CPak file when you choose the last game played method. That would make things infinitely easier to manage and way more reliable.
Jim Rivers, get the soil sample!
I suppose the topic of save files is a good jumping off point as any for me to briefly mention some of the nicer features you can expect if you're upgrading from an EverDrive64 2.5 to an X7. Probably the most important, dedicated save file memory. On the older cartridges, you were required to reset the system to write the save file to the SD card. We're talking EEPROM, save RAM, and flash RAM files. If you forgot to do this, then they'd be lost. The X7 keeps them in the memory and writes to the safety of the SD card the next time you turn on the console. This dedicated memory also makes it so that Pokemon Stadium will work.
Here's the first move. That did little damage. There, defense stat went down.
A real-time clock is touted as a big feature, but unless you want to play the fan translation of the original Animal Forest, there's little to no reason for you to even give this a second thought. And lastly, there's a USB port for developers. But if you just want to play some games, this is probably something you don't even care much about. When it comes to the EverDrive64 X7, the decision is fairly easy if you already have a version 3. Now, if you're still on 2.5, then I'd say it's a pretty good time to upgrade because I can't imagine another version will ever be necessary. From the release of Retro USB's Power Pack in mid-2007, a flash cart for the original Nintendo 8-bit was a dream come true for fans of the system. Krikzz's NES offering, the EverDrive N8, arrived in 2013 and addressed a number of the shortcomings of the Power Pack, as well as incorporating some cool new features. The subsequent announcement and release of the EverDrive N8 Pro in late 2019 was a bit of a surprise to many, myself included. The N8 had consistently seen robust updates since its inception, with one major update as recent as December of 2019, after the announcement of the Pro. These updates usually included support for additional mapper chips, which were used to enable a variety of enhancements to NES games over the years. Regardless, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the original N8's power was getting close to being tapped out. Like its predecessor, the EverDrive N8 Pro is available in two different form factors, NES, and Famicom. Outside of a change from using normal-sized SD cards to micro SD, you'd be hard-pressed to find any obvious physical traits that separate the old and new-styled cart's outward appearance. On the other hand, the Famicom version is quite a bit taller than the original. Both sell for around $170, which is a $50 price increase over the aging original. This is justified by a thorough set of upgrades, such as a Cyclone 4 FPGA and an improved amp for expansion audio. After 7 years, software support was extremely comprehensive on the original N8. This has been carried over to the Pro without missing a beat, and NES, Famicom, and Famicom Disk System are all playable here. In fact, all of the great features that people loved about the original N8 have been improved and iterated upon incrementally, such as being able to activate 8 Game Genie codes at one time versus 5, and the exFAT file system being supported. Faster game loading is also touted, but I never really felt that was an issue before. Famicom Disk System games will flip sides automatically as it's needed, but in the instance it doesn't work as it should, a physical disk side flip button is there to help you out. The list of supported mappers continues to expand, and as of the time of this video, sits at around 202 for the Pro version versus the 173 of the older version. So more games are supported, although most of these apply to homebrew games. But more is always better, right? The original N8 allowed for quick saving and loading of states using a 2-button combination, a super handy feature for some of the more brutal games in the system. The Pro expands on this ability by giving you the option for a full-on in-game menu, which has up to 99 save state slots available per game. Honestly, this is more than any sane person will ever need, but I find it super useful just in case I need to capture gameplay of certain segments of games in the future. Cycling through the different save states gives the time and date that they were created thanks to the N8's real-time clock, so you can be conscious of not only which saves have been occupied, but also so you don't overwrite your most recent save. Each slot is stored within the snap folder as individual files so you can easily back them up or share them with other N8 Pro owners if you want. There is something to be said for the quickness of the older method. Thankfully, you can revert to that setting by toggling the in-game menu to QSS via the option menu. The button combination used to access the menu or quickly save and load your state can be set to your preference via the in-game combo menu option. Here's a quick tip: if you happen to have one of those 8BitDo wireless NES controllers that has a home button, then setting the save state key to down plus select will quickly take you to the in-game menu with a single push of that button. Pretty neat. The audio balance option lets you tweak levels of various expansion audio chips like the VRC6 and Sunsoft 5B. A number of presets are included to match with the various Famicom hardware out there, and function seamlessly when using a Famicom version of the N8 Pro with a Famicom console. If you have a North American system, things aren't so cut and dry. There's a mod required that does require a bit of soldering. While some people have done this mod using just a resistor, Voltar has developed a properly attenuated board that sounds great, and installing it is a cinch. If you have a top loader, then you'll need to apply an additional mod to the N8 itself, bridging a wire between pins 54 and 51. This is pretty simple for even a novice, but hey, I was a little out of practice when I did it myself. It ain't exactly pretty, but it works. However, if you have a high-def NES HDMI mod installed, or a system like Retro USB's AVS, then you're all set. The expansion audio is handled by the hardware automatically. Speaking of the high-def NES, the first production run of the N8 Pro had a strange hardware incompatibility, which caused issues with NES consoles equipped with this mod, causing a black screen. This has been cleared up with following production runs, and now seems to run flawlessly. If you did end up with one of these early units and either have or plan to install a high-def mod at some point, you probably want to contact either Stone Age Gamer or Krikzz to swap it out. Also of note when it comes to the Pro's audio is the inclusion of a built-in NSF player. NSF stands for Nintendo Sound Format, which is a file type which contains audio information from NES games. Loading up an NSF file will play the music using the original console hardware for your listening pleasure. fans of the hacking scene will get a lot out of the N8 Pro's increased ROM memory, which allows for some of the more demanding fan hacks out there, such as Rockman 4 Minus Infinity and Zelda The Legend of Link. These are among the upper echelon of fan hacks out there and are full-fledged games well worth looking into. The EverDrive N8 Pro is certainly a worthy upgrade, but represents a bit of a conundrum for those looking to do so. After all, the original was already super good, unless you were looking for support of some of the more obscure games, or some of the beefier fan hacks, or even a nearly endless supply of save state slots. It might be hard to justify the extra cost at this time. Still, there's a lot of horsepower left under the hood that has yet to be unlocked, so the potential for interesting features is pretty great. When Terra Onion announced the Mega SD flash cart in June of 2019, it represented the first true competition that any EverDrive had seen in a significant amount of time. Inside of the Virtua Racing shaped cartridge was an ultra-powerful FPGA capable of emulating Sega CD hardware. For many, such as myself, this was a dream come true. But not one to sit idly. Krikzz set to work on his own version that could compete. After around a year of development later, we were introduced to the Mega EverDrive Pro, an updated flash cart that featured, you guessed it, Sega CD support. Fitting inside of a standard-sized cartridge shell, the Mega EverDrive Pro retails for around $200, which is about $35 more expensive than the Mega EverDrive X7, but about $70 cheaper than Terra Onion's offering. A majority of this price difference comes down to components used. The Mega SD offers a little more power, which affords some wiggle room for possible future enhancements. But it's important to keep this in perspective. Terra Onion's Mega SD was released a full year before the Pro, and was the first of its kind. In this time, Krikzz was able to examine and evaluate it while developing his own, which allowed him to pinpoint exactly where to cut costs, while maintaining nearly equivalent functionality, at least for the time being. Of course, developing such a complicated device will have some hiccups along the way. The early days had a number of quirks, such as having to combine Sega CD disk images into one file, but Krikzz has been working to smooth out a lot of these issues, and has released 1 to 2 updates a month since its launch in June of 2020. As of the time of this video, the most recent version is 4.07, so there's bound to be plenty more tweaks and optimizations in the future. Despite the extra power, the menu layout is the same as it ever was, at least at first glance. There's such a simplicity to all of the EverDrive menus that I find efficient and comforting. But the most recent update takes a nod from the EverDrive64 and has an option for a background, animated backgrounds even. As with the Mega EverDrive X7, Sega Genesis functionality remains top tier. Compatibility was close to perfect before, but the Pro notably adds support for the Sega SVP enhancement chip used in Virtua Racing. As is the case with all Genesis flash carts, 32X support is there, but it requires that you have a 32X attached to the system. Due to the nature of how the 32X combines video signals from both the 16-bit hardware and the add-on, it would require some sort of video pass-through to get this working right. As it stands right now, the 40-ish games that use the add-on simply aren't worth the extra effort and cost to justify. As expected, Sega Master System games are supported along with full YM2413 FM expansion audio for games that took advantage of this. Although I tend to prefer the PSG sound, the FM sound sounds pretty good to my ears. The in-game menu that was featured in the Mega EverDrive X7 has been given a bit of a power-up. You can still access it using a 2 or 3 button combination of your choice, but now the save state feature gives you up to 100 save slots per game. The built-in real-time clock will let you track the time and date that the save was created. But if you step into the Save Snapshot archive inside the Mega folder, you can actually preview a snapshot of the exact moment the save state was made. This is pretty cool, but I wish it was possible to view these within the in-game menu itself. As it is, it's a novel idea with limited usefulness. Although going in and out of the menu is ultra quick and seamless, there's also an option for a quick save and load button combo that can be used in tandem with the in-game menu. It's not an either-or situation like with the N8 Pro. Being able to rapidly save and reload is super nice for speedrunners who like to practice certain segments over and over again, and I hope that a similar option is added to the N8 Pro in the future. In-game menu performance isn't always perfect though. While it's typical for certain sounds or tones to linger or stop working altogether when going in and out of the in-game menu, there's also risk of graphical corruption, like this one I ran into with Shinobi 3. And yes, it's tied to the save state, so resetting the game and reloading the slot won't help you here. It's a total loss. One surprising feature is the capacity for save states in Sega Master System games, which effectively negates the need for a Master EverDrive X7, unless you're absolutely dead set on playing on an original SMS. A 3-input combination consisting of a D-pad direction plus buttons B and C is needed to activate it, which leads to the various quirks tied to the Master EverDrive that I mentioned earlier. Strangely, the Mega Pro does give you the option for setting this combo to buttons that aren't even active with the SMS, such as START and A. Alas, tying any of these inputs to the hotkeys simply does not work. As it stands, the Mega SD currently lacks any sort of in-game menu for 8-bit games, much less saving and loading states, and requires a full-on power cycle to get back to the main interface. Also, the in-game menu cannot be accessed if you're using a 32X, on anything. When the Mega EverDrive Pro was first revealed, probably the most surprising feature was the inclusion of an NES core. Yes, you can play NES ROMs on your Sega Genesis. No, it's not a replacement for a real NES. It's certainly fascinating that Krikzz was able to do it, but it's not something I would consider a reason to buy it or anything. Compatibility is spotty, with some real classics either being glitchy or not working at all. Sound is a mixed bag. Music sounds surprisingly good, while sound effects can be way off. Although I'm wondering if this could have anything to do with the slight difference in speed, where the Genesis runs at a slightly lower refresh to the NES. Of course, all this is ancillary to the star of the show, Sega CD support. If the Mega EverDrive Pro is on your radar, then this is likely the reason why. The Mega SD really set a standard upon release, giving you a sizable lineup of tweaks that not only streamline the experience, but also allow you to approximate original hardware in various ways, if you so choose. The Pro might be lacking some of the nuanced sliders and toggles of the SD, but it's entirely possible that some of these aspects are totally inconsequential to you. Before you get into anything, there's 2 specific factors to keep in mind. First, if you have a real Sega CD connected to your Genesis, you'll want to separate the two. Secondly, Sega CD games need a BIOS file to run. These are obtainable from various corners of the internet, and you'll need to drop them into the specific folder on the SD card as well as rename them based on each region. Games are stored on the SD card nested within their own folders, and can be in a .bin and .q, .iso, and .img format. If you have a multi-disc game, you can put all disc images into the same folder, and the game should swap discs automatically at the necessary time. In some cases, like with Slam City, which has nonlinear progression from disc to disc, it's not always apparent that the change has taken place. It's also led to some glitchiness for me in this particular case.
Come on and get it before I serve it to you!
On the Mega SD, you can swap discs manually by going into the in-game menu. But as of right now, the Mega EverDrive Pro does not have an in-game menu for Sega CD games. so you'll have to power cycle the system or press the power button on the top of the cartridge itself to reboot. Another area where the in-game menu for Sega CD games gives the Mega SD an advantage over the EverDrive is with the handling of cheats. The Mega SD utilizes RAM cheats, which are input and activated via the in-game menu. Doing so will constantly write values to a specific RAM address, which in turn does specific things, like gives you infinite health and so on. Sort of like how a Game Shark or Action Replay work on a PlayStation 1. These can be enabled and disabled at any time during gameplay, although the changes don't always take effect right away. The EverDrive, on the other hand, writes a code to the game's .qsheet file when booting the game. In theory, I suppose this should work fine, but I couldn't find any codes which use this approach for cheats, so I can't be sure how well they work, much less even exist. Most games should see at least some sort of loading speed improvement. Especially egregious examples, like Willy Beamish, are improved so significantly you won't know what to do with all the extra time you have left in the day. Other games, you might see a couple of seconds here and there, but it's not exactly world-shattering. The greatest relief is not having to worry about the wear and tear on your nearly 3-decade-old optical laser and drive belt. Save files were always a bit of a challenge if you happened to own more than 5 Sega CD titles. The internal save memory was excruciatingly small, while a backup RAM card helped alleviate this issue in the long run. With the Mega EverDrive Pro, you can choose to have one single internal and cartridge save pool for all your game saves if you like dealing with original hardware limitations. Or you can choose to have the cart create one of each on a per-game basis. Although I haven't quite figured out a workflow for getting my currently existing save files moved over to the Pro yet, I definitely say that the latter is an infinitely more useful approach. Oh, just in case it wasn't obvious, like the Mega SD, there is not an option for save states with CD games. Speaking for myself, one of the most appealing aspects of the Mega SD was the use of MD4EA to dial in the sound filtering of the Sega CD core to be as close to the real thing as possible. This was some nice attention to detail, and was realized through manipulating CD audio treble boost and a low-pass filter. While these are present in the Mega Pro, they're limited to simply on and off toggles. I'm also unsure if MD4EA was employed during the development of these filters. One final note on audio. Perhaps the most exciting innovation of the Mega SD was the Mega Drive Plus format, which took inspiration from MSU1 games on the SD2SNES and allowed for CD audio combined with cartridge games. This was possible on real hardware, but was never utilized by anyone outside of indie developer Watermelon for their game Pure Solar. Since the release of the MSD, there's been several Mega Drive Plus releases worth checking out. Although seemingly still in the early stages of development, Krikzz has created MSU-MD, the EverDrive equivalent to MD+. A welcome addition for sure, but in its current state, these enhanced audio ROMs can be a bit obtuse to figure out and get working. You need to move .ips patches around and rename files, but hopefully this will be streamlined in the future. Compared to the Mega Drive Plus implementation, this feature works well, but it's missing the ability to seamlessly loop tracks at specified points, which doesn't quite make for as fluid of an experience. Finally, a fascinating addition is the Mega Color Video Player, which allows for smooth, high-color video playback on your Genesis system. I don't know how this was done, but it's incredibly impressive. It's more of a novelty right now, but as it evolves, I can't help but wonder if we might see ports of some Sega CD games with nicer video in the future. The Mega EverDrive Pro is certainly a great addition to the overall lineup. Some might feel sad that they didn't hold out for the Mega Pro, while others are thrilled with the more refined options of the Mega SD. But think about it. The beautiful thing about two of these devices being on the market is that the competition drives innovation, and we, the consumer, benefits the most. If a unique feature is present in one version, chances are it's only a matter of time before it shows up in the other. When the life cycle of both carts are complete, their functionality will probably be nearly identical, and the last thing you'll be thinking about is whether you saved $70 years ago, or that you had an extra year to enjoy the benefits of Sega CD games on a flash cart. Although that brings us to the end of the newest EverDrives available, there is one final device that lies on the periphery that I think it's high time that we revisit. I'm talking, of course, about the SD2SNES Pro, which arrived to mixed reactions in early 2019. But before we get into that, let's step back in time and take a look at all the incredible ways the original SD2SNES has evolved since we last had a look. Since its release, the SD2SNES, developed by Atari 01, quickly became the de facto standard by which all future flash carts would be judged. Despite a higher than normal price tag than your average flash cart, its beefy hardware, along with some stellar programming, has led to an incredibly long tail of development. Amazingly enough, new features are still being added to this day. Before we get into the real good stuff here, I think it's worth noting some of the smaller tweaks to the SD2SNES's repertoire that don't get enough love. I'm talking about the LED brightness level. No, not really, but I was pleasantly surprised to see it added at an OS level. No more electrical tape for me. But seriously, owners of a one-chip console will want to direct their attention to the transient fixes and brightness limit settings. It's known that stock one-chip consoles output too bright of an image, resulting in loss of detail. This can be addressed by either installing a properly attenuated RGB bypass kit, or using HD Retrovision component cables with the brightness switch turned off. If you don't have either of these, then the brightness limit setting will be your best friend. I found that -1 seems to be the sweet spot for me, but you might want to test some of the other values to see which works best for you. One-chip transient fixes is more specific. It's designed to fix some of the issues that are inherent to one-chip systems. It also accounts for some of the weirdness that can arise if the C11 capacitor has been replaced. For more info on both of these issues, check out RGB 309 of the RGB Masterclass here on MLeg. Alright, now on to the good stuff. Thanks to the dedication of a programmer known as Red Guy, support for the remaining heavy hitter expansion chips was achieved in 2018. Obviously, I'm talking about Super FX and SA1, which were long thought to be nearly impossible given the complexity of integrating these add-ons. Super FX support was extremely timely thanks to the official release of the long since cancelled Star Fox 2 on the SNES Classic Edition. Being able to play it on original hardware was a real treat, unless you decided to spring for a reproduction cartridge of it. For many though, the real highlight of this edition means support for Yoshi's Island. For better or worse, these games run at their normal frame rate, although the menu system does have a setting for Super FX speed. Toggling this to fast seems to speed up the game's overall speed, but it doesn't seem to increase the frame rate. In practice, this means there will be times when certain sound effects, such as the radio chatter in Star Fox, won't have time to finish before the next sample plays. Ultimately, it's not too much of a hindrance, but it will seem off for those who know the games extremely well. SA1 support unlocks 34 games. Kirby Superstar and Super Mario RPG are the big ones that will pop in most people's minds. For me, being able to play the fan translation of the Eiji Aonuma directed Marvelous is where the real party is. The only major limitation of SA1 games is that there's simply not enough room left on the FPGA to allow for MSU1 enhanced audio. Slightly disappointing, but a small price to pay considering the SA1 was thought to have never been possible in the first place. Another new addition is the SDD1 chip, which isn't nearly as exciting as the previous two. It's most recognizably used in the SNES version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, which is an impressive, if inessential, port of the CPS2 game. With the announcement of the SD2SNES Pro, I think many buyers of the original felt a little bit burned. The original was touted as a final design, meaning that it was so powerful it would never need an update. And as Super FX and SA1 were added, this inspired even more confidence. So it's easy to see why owners of the seemingly out-of-date original hardware were annoyed. But with so many components of the original no longer being produced, designer Ikari01 and manufacturer Krikzz had little choice in the matter. An even bigger surprise came in late 2019 when the SD2SNES received a complete rebrand to become the FXPak Pro. Like the name or hate it, this change was due to the pressure from several corporations, Panasonic, SanDisk, and Toshiba, for using the initials SD in the device's name. More powerful tech and a move to micro SD aside, as of right now, the new hardware has meant very little in the overall scope of things. Most newly developed features are supported by both the Classic and the Pro, although there are some minor Pro exclusive features which have begun to creep in here and there, such as SA1 games being able to use MSU1 enhanced audio. The FXPak Pro retails for the same price as the original, around $200. If the allure of future-proofing and new technology is too strong, Stone Age Gamer offers a trade-in program so you can soften the blow just a little bit. Filed away under "I would have never thought of this" when I did the first flashcart video is Super Game Boy support. Popping up seemingly out of nowhere from a developer going by the name of Redacted 173, this unexpected surprise is not integrated in the official firmware as of the time of this video, but it's only a matter of time since they've been working with Ikari01 to make it a standard feature. Best of all, Super Game Boy is supported across the board, so whether you have the original SD2SNES or an FXPak Pro, you're free to enjoy some Donkey Kong 94 and the loads of games that came out for the iconic portable. As of right now, you'll need to procure the required BIOS files from the internet to make it work. But once that's done, just select a Game Boy title from your SD card and you're off. Standard operations of the Super Game Boy apply here. Game Boy and Super Game Boy Enhanced games work just as they would with a real Super Game Boy. Obviously, Game Boy Color titles will not work, but there were several cross-generation carts which had black shells, like Link's Awakening DX, that will. Press L and R simultaneously within a game to set your border, color palette, and button layout. The evolution of Super Game Boy support has been really something to behold, offering some really cool options in its current state. Initially meant to emulate only the more speed-accurate Super Game Boy 2, you can now select the slightly faster clock speed of the original Super Game Boy. And yes, MSU1 support for Game Boy is now a reality, and it's not exclusive to the Pro only. You can expect this feature to work on the Classic as well. Also surprising, save states. By holding X and pressing L or R, you can save and load states. Pretty handy. Of course, basic in-game hook functionality applies here. Just hold L, R, select, and X to return to the main menu. So what sort of upgrades lie in the future for the FXPak Pro? We know that an oft-requested save state feature is in the works thanks to a developer and speedrunner named Furious. And there might be a chance that we might see enhanced frame rates for Super FX games too. To be honest, outside of those, I'd be hard-pressed to think of any more killer features that really need to be added. Well, outside of the tiny handful of as of yet unsupported helper chips, that is. So there you go, the state of the newest EverDrive releases as of 2020. What do you think? It bears repeating that the existence of new versions does not mean that your old EverDrives will cease to work. If you've been perfectly content with them up to this point, there's probably little reason to upgrade right now. But if some of these features are just what you've been waiting for, then have at it. In a time when there's constant new developments coming out of the retro gaming enthusiast scene, devices like flash carts are still amazing to me. Even though they've been around for the better part of 15 years, that they're still being iterated upon with increased functionality is a testament to just how essential they are for not only newcomers, but longtime fans as well.